Well, here we are once again with another exciting edition of the Brattlecast, the podcast emanating from the Brattle Bookshop in Boston on West Street. It's an institution. You got to check it out. It's so much fun, as are these conversations. I'm Jordan Rich, and with me, of course, is Ken Gloss, the proprietor of the Brattle Bookshop. And it's more than books. We see this all the time. It's all kinds of memorabilia, archival material. And today we're going to talk about a rather impressive letter.
Well, it is. You know, one of the things, what I feel a lot of this is about is the story, the fun, the where did it come from? Where did you get it? What is it? What's the story behind it? Why would somebody even care? Well, I got a call from a lady, and this was a while ago, and she said she had some letters that had been to members of her family and so on, and she was describing them, and I decided to go down and visit, and a few of them stood out, but there was actually an interesting connection between two of them, but this one was dated April 26, 1864, Washington. And it starts off thanking someone for a donation. Your generous remittance of $75 for the wounded and sick was duly received by letter of the 21st and most acceptable. So much good may be done with a little. I find may go a great ways. It is perhaps like having a store of medicines. The difficulty is not so much in getting the medicines. It is not so important about having a great store as it is important to apply them by rare perception, honest personal investigation, true love, and, if possible, the inspiration tact we have in other fields called genius. And this letter goes on for 4 pages talking about the hospitals being full. And, of course, what they're talking about is the Civil War.
And we've talked about this before in a previous episode. I know it's a different letter that we're talking about.
Right. And you know, reading that sentence, it's so beautifully worded and expressed. Well, the writer was Walt Whitman.
He knew how to put words together, absolutely.
And I had done on an Antiques Roadshow a letter of Walt Whitman's that actually is one of the favorite things that I've done on the Antiques Roadshow. Was, again, a 4-page, a little longer than this one. But the letter, when you read it, you wouldn't necessarily think that it was more a personal letter to someone writing home that they were sick and that they hoped they were going to get better. Unfortunately, they didn't. But hospitals during the Civil War, that's right. Another thing. And that letter was in the words of the person who was the patient. Mm-hmm. At the very end of that letter was a little parenthesis and written by his friend Walt Whitman. Whitman volunteered in the hospitals and helped people either who were too sick to write or were illiterate and couldn't write. He was writing. That's how he volunteered and helped. So that letter sort of surprises you at the end because it's in the person of the patient. This one he wrote to a friend, and he also had essentially a charity going on where he was asking friends and people he knew for donations to get supplies at the hospital. I mean, you know, in the next paragraph, he's saying the hospitals are again full as nearly all last week's trains were arriving off and on from the front with sick. Very many of these, however, will be transferred north as soon as practicable. Unfortunately, large numbers are irreparably injured in these jolting railroads. In other words, in ambulances. In other words, he's saying not only were they injured on the field, but just the transporting from the battlefield, either in train, ambulance, or carriage. Right. He said a lot of them were more injured in the transport.
Well, it's so interesting. By the way, this was in Washington, I believe, right?
He was in
the hospital in Washington.
In the hospital in Washington. It's essentially the precursor to Walter Reed.
Oh, okay, right.
Yeah.
And as we all know, historically, I believe disease took as many lives, if not more, than the actual battle wounds.
You know, I actually think that happens in a lot of wars. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you think of World War I, the Spanish flu or the flu, I mean, the conditions that soldiers on the front are
prior
in.
to penicillin and so forth.
They're cold, they're wet, they're, so on. Another time I had gotten a letter of a journal of a surgeon a Northern surgeon in the Civil War. He was stationed in Texas on the battlefields, and he's writing these long, long notes at the end of the day about the day's practices, what was going on, how it was going. And you're saying to yourself, with all of these injuries he's describing and all of this terrible goings on, how did he ever have this much time? And then you stop and realize most of them he couldn't do anything for them. Even the smallest infection then.
Right.
With, like you said, without penicillin, or they use sulfur for disinfectant. But it's
devastating to think about that. And then you also have, you mentioned surgeon. I mean, most of the surgery was amputation at that point.
They cut and,
Right.
gangrene, surgery, painkillers weren't there.
So was Whitman, do you think, unusual in that he was a celebrity, if you would, who volunteered his time, or do you think he was one of more than many who did that?
He was unusual in a way that he was a celebrity. He was very well known. By 1855 is when he came out with the first edition of Leaves of Grass. Mm-hmm. So within his knowledge and people that he knew, he was very well known. But he wasn't in the war, but his brother was in the war. And one of the reasons he was volunteering was because his brother was out on the front and he wanted to be able to help in many ways. And the other thing that Whitman says in this letter we have, you must accept the men's thanks through me. I shall remain here among the soldiers in hospital through the summer with short excursions down in the field, and what help you can send me for the wounded and sick, I hardly say how gladly I shall receive, and apply it personally to them. So he was there partly, it was the Civil War, he wanted to help. He wasn't a soldier at the time. His brother was involved, and he actually went down a few times to see if his brother was all right. Mm-hmm. His brother made it through the Civil War. So that was the way he could help.
Interesting.
And then also he was well enough known that through these letters, I didn't realize he also was soliciting donations. Now, he said your very generous remittance of $75. Today, that doesn't sound like a lot.
That's big money back then. That is a serious amount of
money.
Dollars,
and one of the things that I love about this, it's in a piece of plastic, but it can go,
right.
that I can put my finger and touch, and I can say to myself, Walt Whitman touched this piece of paper. He put down his ideas and thoughts on this piece of paper. And it will eventually go into a collector, to an archive. Sure. I haven't decided yet. We only got it about a month ago, and I'm sort of cherishing it.
Well, I'm glad you brought it in to show me, and the podcast, Brattlecast, gets a chance to see it before it leaves and goes anywhere.
Well,
what I did want to mention was, and I remember learning this much more when I watched the Ken Burns Civil War series, the letter writing in general back then was, even from non-educated soldiers, conscripted, were so eloquent and so well thought out and so well parsed. It's obviously a different era.
Well, one of the things, too, when you're looking at that type of letters, there also were lots and lots and lots of letters sent. There tend to be much, much more in the Union than in the Confederacy. And there's a few reasons for that. One, the Union soldiers tended to be better educated than the Confederate soldiers. Mm-hmm. Two, if you put something up in an attic in Maine or New York, it can sit there for 100, 200 years and not, there obviously can be problems, mm-hmm. but it can sit there. If you put that same group of letters in Alabama, in Florida, with the humidity, before air conditioning, before all of that, a lot of that paper just molds away. And so that's another reason. And a lot of the letters, when you're on the battlefield, one of the great joys of many of the soldiers is being able to still correspond with home, getting letters from home. It makes a lot of the feeling of what was going on there, you can relieve it a little. You can escape it. And letters was one of the ways. You can't, I don't think they had FaceTime.
No, they did not.
I really don't think they did.
But one consideration, and we live in such an amazing era, Ken, as you know, but it took a long time for a letter to be delivered, particularly to the front. So that news that you got from home might be a month old, if not older.
Not only did it take a lot of time, is where were you? I mean, you might be in one place one day, and if there's troop movements, you might be somewhere else there, and the in-between might be very dangerous. So yes, it could take a long time to get back and forth.
But it's such an important aspect of the military life to have that PO, that post office ability back then, and even now electronically, digitally. But for a guy like Walt Whitman to obviously volunteer his time and then take the time to write such a beautiful, eloquent letter, it really speaks to him.
There's one little extra to this one, and I'm not sure. Hopefully, we'll be able to work it out where these go together. There's a letter. It's a general letter. It's about 6 months after, 6 months before. I'm sorry, October 7th, 1863, and it's respects, appeal. They're talking about sale of a house, attention, but the last little bit of the letter is thank you very much of sending money to Mr. Whitman's charity. So in the letter 6 months later, Mr. Whitman is thanking the thing. In this letter, they're talking about giving money to Mr. Whitman's charity. This letter is signed Ralph Waldo Emerson. So they obviously knew each other. And here are two of the great literary figures of the 19th century, both involved, maybe from a distance, but in the Civil War, caring about the soldiers, caring about what was going on, and actually speaking of each other.
You actually teased one of the next Brattlecast subjects. We're going to be talking about another letter from
another letter
man you just mentioned.
Exactly. And many times you get letters of Whitman, of Emerson, or many famous people, and the gist of the letter is, thank you for asking me to speak. I'm sorry I can't attend, which probably are way more than the thank you for asking me to speak. I'll be there tomorrow.
Right.
But a lot of letters are very perfunctory. It's really nice to get letters that there's actually some thought, that there's something that the historians can go. And one of the things, particularly with Whitman, there's an archive of the Walt Whitman's letters, writings, and so on. And we looked this up. This letter from April 26, you put in the date, and it comes up. And the obviously it's known he probably kept copies of his letters as he wrote. And it's known, and when you go to the very end and they say, okay, this is the letter, this is what it contained, and they go, in an unknown collection. So they didn't know where in your studio this letter is right now.
Well, we know, you and I know, and that person you wrested it from knows.
And I get the joy of being able to know that, hold it, read it, think about it, have hopefully either a collector or an archive come in, get it to the right person, decide, because Emerson mentions Whitman's charity, should they sort of go together, or we'll see. It depends on who is interested, but that's almost the hunt and the search and the finding is great fun. Being able to, once you find it, actually be able to conclude the business is great. And then trying to figure out what the right thing and the best way to move it and where to move it to.
And there's one more thing. Talking about it on the Brattlecast is really great because it's fascinating.
Well, that's the part I like. And one of the things that I collect with this, I collect stories, and I have hundreds of like one word. That are also, and these have now, they're at the very end right at the moment, but I'll be adding to it. So that's another story for me.
You've been listening to the Brattlecast, a great story about Walt Whitman and a particular letter. We've got other great stories coming up. My thanks to Ken Gloss as always, sir. We'll see you next time.
It's always fun. And again, I'll mention if people have suggestions, we've gotten a few good ones. Some I've answered through the podcast, and some I answer personally.
And just go to the website, brattlebookshop.com, and it'll all make sense from there. Thank you, sir.